Hi, thanks, Lindsay. So our first speaker is Caroline Jahn. Caroline did her PhD in collaboration between the Brain and Spine Institute in Paris and the Department of Experimental Psychology at the University of Oxford, working with Sebastian Bourret and Mark Walton. She's currently a postdoc fellow at the Princeton Neuroscience Institute, working with Tim Buschman. She studied the neuronal circuit of decision-making, learning, and exploration, with an emphasis on the role of dopamine and noradrenaline and cortical networks. So I welcome the speaker to give us a great talk.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me? Oh, I imagine you can. I think I'm sharing my screen, but screen share.
There should be a button underneath. Yeah, perfect.
Awesome. So I'm sorry. I tried to get this thing to work before, but apparently it was not completely successful. Here we go. Can you see me? Can you see my presentation? Yes?
Yes.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Sorry again. First time I use this app, so it's a bit of a learning curve. And I think for everyone in general using virtual technology. So hello everyone, and thank you for inviting me to talk to this symposium on dopamine. I'm really happy to be here. I'll take a bit of a weird start, I guess, for a symposium on dopamine, because I'm going to tell you about both dopamine and noradrenaline. And hopefully at the end of this talk, you'll be convinced that we kind of need to know about both. So just starting about general anatomy and biosynthesis pathway, funny anecdote, for a long time, people thought that dopamine was only the precursor of noradrenaline, which was one of the first neuromodulator to be found. We've come a long way from that, and we know that both neuromodulator are crucial for many types of behavior. So just quickly, dopamine and noradrenaline are released in different nuclei. Dopamine is produced in the VTA, the ventral tegmental area, and the substantia nigra pars compacta. So as you can see on these pictures, and noradrenaline is produced in the locus coeruleus, and they have different targets. So dopamine is going to be mostly released in the striatum and in the frontal cortex. Noradrenaline is going to be released pretty much everywhere in the cortex, in the cerebellum, and to a small extent in the striatum. Okay, so maybe starting with noradrenaline, as potentially people don't know or don't care as much about noradrenaline. So what do we know that noradrenergic neurons do? So first of all, we know that they respond to salient stimuli. So if I clap my hand, you're going to have a burst of your locus coeruleus, so a transient activation of these noradrenergic neurons. They respond to novel stimuli. So here, this is a study where you show a novel object for the first time, and this leads to a transient activation of the locus coeruleus neurons. And for the second time, you have a very quick habituation. So neurons don't fire as much, so the response is attenuated. They also respond to stimuli that are predictive of reward. So here on the left, you have a CS+, so a transient response to a CS+. On the far right, you have this graded activation by the reward size. So if you have something that predicts small or big reward, you're going to have a greater activation for bigger rewards than smaller ones. And in the middle panel, you have an example of extinction. So you have the CS+ on the top. So for the first trial, you have this nice activation of the LC. For the CS+, extinction very quickly, these locus coeruleus neurons stop firing, and then you have this relearning of the association. And this is very quick. And finally, or not finally, but at least the final thing I'll show you is that noradrenergic neurons respond to the initiation of rewarded action. So for example, here, a go signal, during the production of the action, you're going to have a firing of locus coeruleus neuron. So that's for noradrenaline. Now, what do we know about dopamine? And again, I imagine you know more and you care more, but maybe some features. Dopaminergic neurons also respond to salient stimuli. They respond to novel stimuli. So here you have an example of firing of a neurons for a novel event versus a familiar event. We know that they respond to stimuli that are predicting a reward, as well as change in reward contingency. So here, this is a very elegant study where monkeys could be told in advance whether they were going to be rewarded. So at the target, they would have either information about whether they were going to receive a small or big reward, or no information, so red versus blue. And what we see is that dopaminergic neurons respond to advanced information. So when you know in advance what you're going to have, dopaminergic neurons tend to fire more, and then they also fire when you get big or small information about what's going to happen. Okay. And finally, they also respond to the initiation of rewarded action. So here on the left, this is LCS, this is dopaminergic neuron firing just before the action initiation. And the release of dopamine measured by voltamperometry in the nucleus accumbens also increases when rats perform this a go, no-go task. So whenever they do the action that is going to be rewarded, there is a release of dopamine in the nucleus accumbens. Okay, so from there, you might have noticed the similarities. So we actually see that dopaminergic and noradrenergic neurons respond to very similar features or very similar aspects of the environment. And this can go even further. So if we look at pharmacological study, if we look at what they've been involved to, they've been both involved in memory, attention, learning, motivation, and behavioral flexibility. Both, and so maybe the questions we can ask in the light of these results is, can we really attribute separate roles for the two catecholaminergic neuromodulator in the flexible promotion of actions for reward? And that's really what I'm going to mean by motivation. It's just like this flexible, flexibly giving resources in order to perform actions. Okay, so with that in mind, when I started my PhD, I was very lucky that Chiara Varazzani, who published already this result, had recorded putative noradrenergic and putative dopaminergic neurons in monkeys that were performing an effort-reward trade-off task. And what I'll do is that I'll show you some particular features of this task that were really interesting when we try to disambiguate what dopaminergic and noradrenergic neurons are doing. But first, let's start with the task. So in this task, monkeys were facing a screen. They were holding a clamp, and this clamp measured the amount of pressure they were putting on it. So the harder they would squeeze, the more effort they were producing. So they were fixating the screen. Then a cue came on. This cue was telling them how much they were going to have to squeeze the clamp, and for how much reward they were going to have to do it. And then there was a go signal if they produced the right action. So if they produced enough force at the right time, they would get a feedback and then a reward. And so that's what they had to do. Now, there were some interesting features to this task. The first one was that they had to hold fixation during the whole trial. If they broke fixation, they would restart from the beginning. So the same cue would be shown. If they made an incorrect action, such as not pressing hard enough, pressing too early, etc., then they would have to start from the beginning. And only if they did a correct action would they move on to a different task condition. And then a new task condition would be randomly drawn among these 9 possible cues. And so we have a very interesting feature of this task, which is that from the first time of seeing the cue and getting the information about the task condition to obtaining the reward, you actually are in the same task state. So you know exactly what is going to happen. And your goal to get the reward hasn't been achieved until you get it, right? So whatever happens is part of the same state. And once you do the correct action, you get the reward, then you move on to a new state. And so a state could last one trial. So the monkey would see the cue, produce the right action, and get the reward. It could last several trials. So the monkey could see the cue, break the fixation, see the cue again, make the wrong action, and finally get the reward. So here you have a 3 trials task state, or 2 times, just an incorrect action, etc. And so the first thing we see is that the task duration depends on the task condition. So the more effort they need to produce, the more likely they are to stay longer in this task state. The less reward there is, the more they're likely to stay longer in this task state. So that's the first thing. We can also look at the probability to engage. So the probability that the monkey is actually going to even try to produce the action. So we could record if they were attempting to do the effort. And here again, this probability to engage in the effortful action is modulated by the task condition. So they're more likely to engage when there is a high reward, and they're more likely to engage when there is a low effort. Okay. This we can capture using a GLM. So for the rest of the talk, I'm going to separate dopaminergic sessions, so sessions during which dopaminergic neurons were recorded, and it's going to be in blue, and noradrenergic sessions, so when noradrenergic neurons were recorded, so that's going to be in brown. And here, using this GLM across session, we can see that indeed there is a negative effect of effort on engagement, a positive effect of reward, and a negative effect of trial number. So they get less, they get fatigued, they don't want to do it, they get less thirsty, and this is captured by the trial number. Okay, now the very interesting thing about this task was that, and that's what I'm going to try to convince you about, is that there is something fundamentally different between seeing the cue for the first time, so when you get information about which task states you are, and seeing it the subsequent times when you actually get no new information, you already know what you are. And so that's something that we're going to explore here. So comparing this cue when you get it for the first time to when you already know what is happening and everything is expected. Okay, so I'm going to try to show you how do dopaminergic and noradrenergic neurons respond to three different features of the task. So first of all, at the cue, we're going to look at whether we can predict the engagement in the rewarded effortful action based on the firing of dopaminergic and noradrenergic neurons. So we're going to compare trial in which after the cue they do a fixation break, so they fail to engage, versus they try to engage in the action. Then we're going to look at what happened between a cue that they see for the first time and a cue that they see for the subsequent time, so a change in task state. And finally, we'll look at what is happening at the fixation break. Okay, so let's start by what's happening at the cue. So here are two example neurons. So on the left, we have a noradrenergic neurons, on the right, a dopaminergic neurons. And what we see is that in both cases, so from left to right, you increase the reward, from top to bottom, you increase the effort. And we see that dopaminergic neurons as well as noradrenergic neurons tend to increase their transient activation at the cue when the reward is higher and decrease it when the effort becomes higher. And this again, we can capture in a GLM. So if we look at the neurons activity at cue, we have in general a decrease in activity with effort, an increase with reward, and an effect of trial number. Now, this is very reminiscent of what we saw with the engagement, right? So monkey's engagement was modulated in the same fashion by these three parameters. And indeed, if what we do is that we try to look at how do these neurons encode the probability to engage, we find that they both do. The first way we did this is for each session, we looked at the cue and we looked at the average probability that the monkey was going to engage given the task condition. And this gave us some kind of rough estimate of the incentive value of this cue. And this we regressed to onto the firing rate, and we thought that there was that both dopaminergic and noradrenergic neurons were sensitive to this aggregate value. Now, the second thing we could do is look, if we take the firing of dopaminergic and noradrenergic neurons, can we simply predict on a trial-by-trial basis whether the monkeys were going to engage or not? And again, in both cases, we could. The higher the firing of dopaminergic and noradrenergic neurons, the more likely the monkey was to engage in a particular trial. Okay, so that's the first thing. And on the right, you just see the time course of this beta in the GLM. So the probability to engage given the task condition and the choice to engage, just to show you how many neurons are encoded and when that happens roughly. Okay, so as I told you, one of the important features of this task was comparing when there is a new information, when the task state changed, and when there is no new information, so the task state is the same. And here you have two example neurons on the bottom right. So on the left, we compare what happened when the monkey engaged and what happened when the monkey doesn't engage. And for both these noradrenergic neurons on top and dopaminergic neuron at bottom, you see that there is less transient activity when there is no engagement. So showing that the two neurons do care about this particular behavioral variable. Now we can look at what happened with the task state change. So on the left, you have so panel on the right, left panel, you have a new task state, and you see that both dopamine and noradrenergic neuron transiently are activated when this new information comes on screen. So what happened at the cue? Now, if you look at what happened when there is no task state change, so these gray cues, you see that the activity of the noradrenergic neuron decreases. So it's less active when you already know which condition you're in, and that's not the case for the dopaminergic neuron. And we can capture that again with the GLM, but this time removing the effect of the task condition. So we put ourselves in the null space of task condition, so we remove that, and we see that in noradrenergic neurons, we have both an effect of engagement and task state change. So again, the neuron cares about both, but it's not the case in dopaminergic neurons, which only care about engagement. So they're only sensitive to whether or not you engage in the task, not whether the cue is newly presented or you already know in which condition you are. Okay, and again, on the left, we can look at when these things happen, and we see that this is pretty prevalent in this task state chain is prevalently encoded in noradrenergic neurons, but not in dopaminergic neurons. Okay, so going back to our three features, we can already say that we see a difference between what happens. So both dopamine and noradrenergic neurons care about the engagement, so they're going to be more active when the monkey engage in the effortful action for a reward, but only noradrenergic neurons care about whether it is the cue that is presented is signal a new task state, so some new information is being brought, or whether there is no new information. Okay, so now we can look at what happened when monkeys make an error, so when they fail to engage with the effortful action. So that's going to be at the fixation break. So first we can look, are neurons even activated when there is a fixation break? And what we saw is that only noradrenergic neurons are going to be activated at fixation break. And we did that by comparing the activity pre-fixation break and post-fixation break. And only noradrenergic neurons show this transient activation at the fixation break. And we can look at it at the population level. So on the right, you see that in general, noradrenergic neurons are more active post than pre-fixation break, but not dopaminergic neurons. Okay. Now, the next question is there some information that is being carried when there is a fixation break, or is it just fixation break activation? Well, for dopaminergic neurons, we didn't see anything. There was no effect. They were not active. They were not encoding any of the task variable. Now, for noradrenergic neurons, things were different. So first of all, this is here an example neurons, and the pink bar represents the fixation break event. And you see that when the reward is higher for this particular trial, the activation at fixation break of noradrenergic neuron is higher. And what we found as well is that noradrenergic neurons that encoded the probability to engage at the task condition at the cue were also encoding this variable at the fixation break. And so there was a sensitivity to the task condition when they were breaking the fixation, so when they were failing to engage with the task condition. And this was rather puzzling, because what kind of information can you carry at that point? That's something we want to explore. Okay, so now this task again has this very interesting feature that if you fail to engage, then the same condition was going to be presented again. And so you knew that if you've been presented with the cue, you would break the fixation, and the same cue would be presented on the next trial. And so that means that at the fixation break, you potentially you could already have a projection of, or you could already have a prediction of what you're going to do on the next trial. And that's what we wanted to see. Like, can we predict what is going to happen on the next trial at the fixation break? And so to do that, we can compare and no engagement in the next trial versus an engagement in the next trial. So in one case, on the next trial you engage, in the other case you don't engage. Okay, and what we saw is that what noradrenergic neurons were encoding at the fixation break was the probability, was basically whether the monkey was going to engage in the next trial or not. The more they were active, the more likely it was that the monkey would engage on the next trial. And this was very prevalent in noradrenergic populations. So you see that the distribution is really tilted towards the right. It's a small but consistent effect across the population. And maybe a slight technical aspect, again, we had to regress out the effect of task condition. So it's not because there was more reward at stake, it's not because they were more likely to engage in high reward trials. Like we regressed that out, and what was left was this probability to engage in the next trial. Okay, so now we can sort of like have the full picture of at least the things we were interested in this task, which is at the fixation break, only noradrenergic neurons are engaged. So only noradrenergic neurons encode the disengagement from the rewarded course of action. And at that point, what they encode is the probability to engage in the next trial. So they carry information about what is going to happen in the future. And so that's something that we thought was really interesting and really separating what dopaminergic and noradrenergic neurons are doing. Okay, so trying to summarize what we found, we see that dopaminergic neurons encode the engagement in the rewarded course of action. So at the cue, they predict whether or not the monkeys are going to engage in the trial, so whether they're going to try to produce the effort in order to get the reward. They do not encode the information. So we've seen that they do not care whether the cue is seen for the first time or for the third time or whatever. They don't care about that. All they care about is what you're going to do about it, like whether you're going to engage or not. And this is striking because this is different to what has been found previously. So for example, I showed you this beautiful experiment in the introduction where dopaminergic neurons were responding to advanced information. So if you were giving them the opportunity to get information about what was going to happen, you had an activation of dopaminergic neurons. Now, the crucial feature of this task is that monkeys actually preferred advanced information. And so what we see is that dopaminergic neurons are going to encode information when it is relevant to guide the behavior. When it's not relevant, like in our case where it doesn't matter whether you see it for the first or the last time, you have no choice in the matter, then dopaminergic neurons do not encode it. And this is crucial because it means that what dopaminergic neurons do not care just about information. They care about information when it guides the behavior, when it enters into the value computation, if you want. This is another experiment in which rats had to do an exploration task, and then they could choose an option that was more or less uncertain. And what we saw is that rats tended to be uncertainty seeking. And if you block nicotinic receptors, dopaminergic receptor, you saw that this uncertainty seeking decreased. And again, this is telling us that only will dopaminergic be important, or at least that's what we think, it's only going to be important when the uncertainty or the information is going to be used to guide the behavior and not in any case. So, again, going in this idea, they do not encode the engagement in the unrewarded action. So they do not encode any action. What they care about is actions that are rewarded, and things that are important to guide the behavior. And so this is in line with a vast literature telling us that the dopamine system is linked to an incentive process, which emphasizes, and with an emphasis on its role in controlling reward sensitivity. And so based on that, what we have as a picture is that dopamine promotes specific actions based on their incentive value. And we'll see this is in contrast to what noradrenaline is doing. So now if we look at noradrenaline, we've seen that noradrenergic neurons also encode the engagement in the rewarded course of action, and that's why we could give them similar roles. However, We've also seen that noradrenergic neurons are activating during the disengagement from the rewarded course of action, so at the fixation break. And we've seen as well that noradrenergic neurons encode the task state change. So when the information is novel, something has changed in the environment. And this is very reminiscent to what has been found and what I showed you earlier, which is that when monkeys were trained to do a go, no-go task, when there was a go, so what you had to produce an action in order to get the reward, then noradrenergic neurons would be activated. If there is a no-go, if you stay in the same state of waiting, doing nothing in order to get the reward, then noradrenergic neurons are not encoded. And so what they care about is a change. In when something occurs that changes the way you need to behave or the way that the environment is structured. And that's what noradrenergic neurons seem to care about. On the other hand, if you look at what dopaminergic neurons do, this is also a go, no go, but here you see that the release of dopamine in the nucleus accumbens is going to increase no matter what the type of behavior you have to have in order to be rewarded. So whether it's a go or whether it's a no-go. Noradrenaline cares about the incentive process, so what it is that you're doing and how it's going to lead to reward. Okay. And we've seen that noradrenergic neurons also encode the engagement in the next trial. So not only what's happening right now, but what should my strategy be in the future? So how has the environment changed? How is the fact that I have disengaged is going to affect what I'm going to do in the future? And I should tell you that this is late enough to be driven by top-down control. So it's very likely that this is something that is being carried by frontal cortex, potentially MCC, ACC, etc., which shows similar feature of errors at the error. Okay, so here we have, in contrast, this idea that noradrenaline could promote the adaptation of the behavior rather than promoting action based on their incentive values. And it's really important that we tease these apart when we try to understand what these two systems are doing. And maybe sort of like a last evidence that this is very likely and why we think that noradrenaline has to do with adaptation of the behavior is a study we did a while ago. So this is a behavioral study in which we had monkeys had two options, and the context was changing, but they had to make the same type of choice in different contexts. And what we saw is that if we give monkeys clonidine, which reduces the availability of noradrenaline, then we reduce the variability in choice. So they become more stereotypical in the way that they make their decision when there is less noradrenaline, and so they're less adaptive, exploratory, etc. So that's a way to understand it. So this is just clonidine. Cool. And so I hope that I've convinced you in a way that in order to understand what dopamine is really doing in the context of motivation, it is crucial to compare what it's doing as opposed to what other neuromodulatory systems are doing. And that's why we thought that this study was particularly interesting. So what we get from that is a picture where dopamine promotes action rewarded towards currently available rewards, so it cares about incentive process. On the other hand, noradrenaline signal and potentially facilitate the need to engage resources to undertake and complete effortful action when important events occur and require adaptation. So we have a system that drives you towards a value maximization policy, and noradrenaline would just like tell you something has changed, you need to adapt your behavior. And yeah, I hope I convinced you, and I hope maybe you want to challenge that or anything. Yeah, so this, I'm currently in Princeton in Tim Buschman lab, but this, although this work was published recently, it was actually done during my PhD. So with Sébastien Bourret, Jérôme Salé, and Mark Walton studying this effect, and these are the people that helped out or participated in the studies I just showed you. Yeah, and I think I'm actually a bit early, 30 minutes, but here we go.
Thank you very much. Here it is. Lindsay, so everybody, just a small notice, I think there's a problem with the chat. So you can just text me directly questions, and I will post them. So just write me directly in the private chat the questions. So I would like to start with just two brief ones. One, do you know or can you speculate what will happen if you inhibit the noradrenergic neurons of the LC? So how the animal will function in this kind of task, or what could you anticipate will be their deficits?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So what we think that noradrenaline is doing is really has to do with exploration, like, changing your behavior in the face of different events. So in this case, if you decrease noradrenaline, if you stop signaling like the novelty of the task, it's not really instrumental in this particular case because it doesn't really matter whether the cue is novel or not. The first thing is that it's likely that you would have less engagement actually. So that's something that we've seen, and particularly engagement in effortful action is going to be dependent on the integrity of your noradrenergic system. So we've seen a clear correlation between the amount of force that monkeys can produce and the activity of the locus coeruleus. And if we give them drugs, then we see that the force that they can produce actually decreases. So you would probably have an effect on the effort component of this task. Probably not on, they would still be motivated by reward because we don't think that this is what the noradrenergic system is doing, but yeah, at least that. For the adaptation, that's interesting. Maybe, not quite sure. We'll have to think about it. Thank you.
Great. And another question regarding drug addiction. So how you would anticipate or predict this a certain drug-seeking model will affect the activity, maybe of both system or each system separately?
Again, very good question. So I'm not an expert of drug addiction. So I think we have a model in which what dopamine is doing is really the incentive process versus noradrenaline has to do with the effort-based motivation. So like how hard are you willing, like how much effort are you willing to put into doing things? In that frame, I would imagine that dopamine really has to do with this, the old craving, wanting sort of like representation of drug addiction. For noradrenaline, what would it do? Make you want to spend less effort in order to do something? Maybe that would be interesting in a study in which you have to exert some kind of effort in order to get your drug or to get the things you want. So we could modulate sort of like the way that people represent how hard it is to obtain something. So you could imagine doing that. So instead of modulating how much you want something, makes you want it less, you could make it seem much harder to get something, so to get your shot or whatever it is. In that frame, like acting on two different levels of motivations, I would say.
Great. And I think for now, a last question. I'm not sure if the chat is not functioning. So just, I don't know if you can say anything about the circuitry and where do you think the action is taking place? So where noradrenaline will affect his effect, and then how this will affect the circuitry. Maybe is it a certain collaboration between dopamine and noradrenaline in the output or in different places doing different things?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I wanted to highlight that at the beginning. So the targets of the dopaminergic and the noradrenergic system are not exactly the same, and that's quite interesting. And I think there is a lot to when you think about the circuitry, there is a lot to unpack. So the noradrenergic system is really going to be affecting the whole cortex, and in particular the motor areas and everything that just like the whole cortex. So that makes it very likely to be involved in producing effort, producing movement, etc. It does not affect very much the striatum. And on the contrary, you have a dopaminergic system that is very much involved in the striatum. So there is little effect. And so you see how you could have different actions. So one of them sort of creating this this association between actions, rewarded actions, and attractive reward and actions rather through the striatum. And on the other hand, a circuit that would tell you just like how easy it is to move or how easy it is to produce an action, how much you want to do, you're willing to put in terms of effort into doing something. So that's quite intriguing. There is a lot of current research that is being done in trying to dissect within the LC and within this dopaminergic nuclei, where are these neurons projecting? So there is this old belief that noradrenergic as well as dopaminergic nuclei are very homogeneous and they sort of like go everywhere. And this has been challenged in recent years, showing that actually certain neurons in the locus coeruleus are going to innervate more the motor areas, and some others are going to be affecting like maybe more frontal areas or different parts. And so there is a very nice circuitry that is not at all, that we could not at all try to tackle in this case because we're just recording blindly in this nuclei. But yeah, it's a very exciting line of research.
And just a small, so what do you think about the prefrontal in which both of them are projecting? That's
a very intriguing question, because I think we know so little about what dopamine is doing in the frontal cortex. And I think that's a very, very cool question. Another interesting thing is that in the frontal cortex, a lot of the dopamine is actually being cleared through a net, so through norepinephrine transporter. So it's very interesting to think that even when pharmacologically, like use atomoxetine, you think that are supposed to be noradrenaline specific, and actually you're going to act as well on dopamine. And so that means that they're very intriguing question, which is there something really specific in the frontal cortex between dopamine and noradrenaline, or are they doing basically the same thing? And if they're doing the same thing, what are they doing? Are they here for behavioral flexibility, adaptation? Like, did we not target, maybe, in our study, we did not target a specific enough part of the SNC, and that's the one that actually is going to care about behavioral flexibility in the prefrontal cortex? Or is it that actually it's primarily something done by dopamine? I don't know, and I think that this is a very exciting line of research, trying to tease apart what is happening for this in the frontal cortex. Yeah.
Great. Thank you very, very much for a wonderful talk and discussion. And